We're back to discuss Ida. And again, we have a choice of reviewing a number of different subjects. The subject I'd like to focus on first is government. And let's look at some of the issues that are raised in Ida. We realize, of course, that this is, to some extent, a story about love life in America. And we are acquainted with Ida's family, those people who are in her family, those whom she loves, those who raise her, those whom she marries. And we realize on page 8 that she is under the governance of her parents. She liked to talk and sing songs. She liked to change places. Wherever she was, she always liked to change places. Otherwise, there was nothing to do all day. Of course, she went to bed early. But even so, she always could say, "What shall I do now? What shall I do?" Someone told her to say, no matter what the day is, it always ends the same day. No matter what happens in the year always ends one day. So we get the idea that she is under the governance of parents, that people are giving her advice. We do know that her parents went off on a trip and never came back. That was the first funny thing. That was the first funny thing that ever happened to Ida. Now, we don't know where her parents went. We don't know why they didn't come back. We don't know whether they were in an accident or whether they died. But to Gertrude Stein, having a mother and father die when she was young, within 1 year of each other, could have suggested they've gone and never come back. We discover then she is living with a great aunt. Ida lived with her great aunt, not in the city, but just outside. So now we have another influence. She was very young, and as she had nothing to do, she walked as if she was tall as anyone. When she was lost, that is to say, a man followed her, and that frightened her so that she was crying just as if she had been lost. And a little while, that is sometime after, it was a comfort to her that this had happened to her. What's going on now? She then goes to live with a grandfather after her great aunt. But let's look on page 9 at her life with this great aunt. First of all, she eats. Eating becomes a way of satisfying one's needs. One day, it was not Tuesday, 2 people came to see her great aunt. Who are these 2 people? They came in very carefully. They did not come in together. First one came and then the other one. One of them had some orange blossoms in her hand. That made Ida feel funny. Who were they? She did not know, and she did not like to follow them in. A third one came along, and this was a man, and he had orange blossoms in his hat brim. He took off his hat, and he said to herself, "Here I am. I wish to speak to myself. Here I am." Now, who are these people coming into the house? Ida began to wonder what was happening to her. She wondered if she ought to go into the home to see whether there was really anyone with her great aunt. And then she thought she would act as if she was not living there, but somebody just coming to visit. And so Ida went on growing older. In other words, you have a young child experiencing fantasies, seeing the hospitality of her aunt. But Ida, growing older, and then she was 16. And funny things happened. Her great aunt went away, so she lost her great aunt, who never really felt content since the orange blossoms had come to visit her. Now, what do you think the orange blossoms were that came to visit her?
A wedding.
Norton?
Someone came to her house and got married. It's what it sounded like to me.
All right. It may have been someone coming, or perhaps the great aunt was sick, and someone was coming to bring her flowers because of an illness that ultimately led to her death, because she did go away. Who displaces her love for her aunt? The dog Love. And then she invents a twin for herself. The bottom of page 10, you have this new definition. Once she has lost her great aunt at the age of 16. She says she had a dog. He was almost blind and from age, not from age, but from having been born so. And Ida called him Love. So now we have a dog, born blind, who is Ida's companion. She's now living not with her great aunt, but with her grandfather. And in love with her dog. In other words, again, this distinction, this differentiation, this objectification of her life. I always used to think that it's good to have a dog in a house. It's better than a psychiatrist. When youngsters get mad, they can talk to their dog, and the dog never talks back to them. And you don't have to go out and hire a psychiatrist to take care of your children, because they've got someone who will listen to them, and someone whom they can love. And she calls her dog Love. The house that Ida lived in was on top of a hill. It was not a very pretty house, but it was quite a nice one. And there was a big field next to it, and trees at either end of the field, and a path at one side of it, and not very many flowers ever, because the trees and the grass took up so much room. But with her dog, she decides to create an alter ego. She creates a twin for herself. She began to sing about her twin. And this is the way she sang. Now we get a song. Oh dear love, that was her dog. If I had a twin, well, nobody would know which one I was and which one she was. And so if anything happened, nobody could tell anything. And lots of things are going to happen. Oh, love, I felt it, yes. I know it. I have a twin. Now, of course, I'm reading this without commas, right? I'm pacing it myself, trying to interpret it myself. You might read it, in fact, somewhat differently. Ida's disassociation, having been separated from her parents, having been separated from her aunt, later on being separated from her grandfather, gives her this capability to stand aside from her experience and remain indifferent to it, to remain stolid against adversity. Like everybody, Ida had lived not everywhere, but she had lived in quite a number of houses and in a good many hotels. Now, obviously, she's not like everybody. Neither Gertrude Stein nor Ida is like everybody living in numerous houses and numerous hotels. America does move a lot, but in the 1910s and 1920s, people were less likely to move very far from their homes. And so Ida, having had this experience, assumes everyone has this experience. And that's, of course, one of the characterizations of objectification. You see yourself, you assume your experiences are parallel to others, and then you move on. Now, there's a very interesting thing about that. Most people would assume that their experiences are unique, interior to themselves, and secretive. We know, for example, that this was one of the great advantages of the Kinsey Report. It suggested that a lot of people are like a lot of other people. And instead of feeling guilty about their sensuality, they recognize that they have a lot in common with other people. Ida feels that everyone has her experience. She is broadening the experience, not turning it inwards. And consequently, every time she does something, it's as though it's a common experience that everyone can share, rather than being an anomalous experience that only a few people can suffer. And we move on into these experiences. Let's go to page 12, where Ida discovers that she is involved with a lot of people. She keeps moving from house to house, from family to family, as relatives die off and who have become committed to her charge. Page 12. And then she began to know a family of little ants. There are 5 of them. They were nobody's ants, but they felt like ants. And Ida went to church with them. Why would she be going to church with all these ants? Press your button. Because they had taken her in. They may not be relatives, but there were communities and there were people who felt responsible for orphans, for people without family, and who would take them in. And so what we have here is literally a unique perception, the enfance of Ida. Whenever you study the enfance in heroic literature, you're studying how a man grew up, where he got his strength. In the famous Old English poem Beowulf, when Beowulf describes his undersea contest with Breca, this is part of his enfance. He was a young man having to prove his mettle. Achilles being dipped and having his heel unprotected has an element of the enfance here. And so we have the enfance of Ida, what happened when she was younger and how she survived. And we see again this disassociation on page 13. The 5 aunts and Ida went on, and they said good night to her, but she never saw them again. These were the first and last friends she ever had, and she really never went to church again. Not really. Let's move on in this definition and try to find out what kinds of people. We find Ida meeting people in uniform. If you look at page 17, we get our first person in uniform. She was walking with her dog Love. They were walking, and suddenly he left her to bark at something. That something was a man stretched out by the side of the road, not sleeping because his legs were kicking, not dead because he was rolling, not happy because he just was not. And he was dressed in soldier's clothing. Love, the dog, went up to him, not to sniff, not to bark. He just went up to him, and when Ida came near, she saw he was not a white man. He was an Arab. And there we get her introduction to someone unique and someone different. Go to page 28 in the second chapter, where she meets another man in uniform, this time a soldier. And of course, she is interested in soldiers. She marries soldiers. The bottom of page 28, Ida says, she commenced to talk. She liked to see people eat in restaurants and wherever they eat, and she liked to talk. You could always talk with Army officers, she did. Army officers do not wear their uniforms in the cities. Soldiers do, but officers do not. This makes conversation with them easier and more difficult. Why would it make it both easier and more difficult? It depends on the person. It depends on the approach. It depends on the associations. If an officer met Ida, he said, "How do you do?" And she answered, "Very well, I thank you." They were as polite as that. On page 231, we see her meeting lots of officers. And on page 29, the page before, we find that Army officers, people are impressed by soldiers who give orders. There are a number of states that Ida can go to. She can go to New England, Maine, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island. Instead, she decides to go to Connecticut. And there she meets men and discovers some interesting things about them. And again, we're talking about government. She meets Sam Hamlet on page 32. And we discover the statement, Ida began to think about what would happen if she were married. Now, here we have a number of situations. Ida has gone through her enfance. She's been moved from family to family. She's gone from one belief to the other. She's been influenced by aunts, grandfathers, strangers she calls aunts. Now she's reached a certain level of maturity. Obviously, when she goes from state to state, she's occupied, she's working, she's earning a living. But as she moves from state to state, moving in war circles, this of course is 1940 when she wrote, 1941, she published Ida. Obviously, there is some concern about military uniforms, military buildup in 39 and 40. World War II actually began in 1939. And now Ida's thinking about marriage. Once she thinks about marriage, she is going to marry. So we now move from the enfance into marriage state. Now, having been governed in these family ways, how is she going to manage being governed in a marriage relationship? She's thinking about men on page 33. We discover that she's moved from state to state. She leaves Connecticut, thinking about getting married. And we discover there was a woman in California. Her name was Eleanor Engl, and she had property. And she wrote to everybody to come out, and Ida went to stay out with her. As she walked in California, living with this entrepreneur, thinking about marriage, Ida begins to think about the quality of men whom she could marry. And we have this statement. As she walked along, she thought about men, and she thought about presidents. She thought about how some men are more presidents than other men when they happen to be born that way. And she said to herself, which one is mine? She knew that there must be one that could be hers, one who would be president. And so she sat down and was very satisfied to do nothing. Now, she thought about how some men are more presidents than other men. Some girls in high school and college, some women in college are always thinking about how tall the person is they're going to marry, because they're already anticipating what the children will look like. You see, there's always this anticipation, and so we have Ida now in a second stage, looking forward to a relationship. She meets a man, she meets Arthur. And where does she meet Arthur? She meets Arthur sleeping under a bridge. And we discover that Arthur later becomes an officer in the army. Gertrude Stein writes that everybody wants a king and observes Arthur. Now let's look at Arthur for a few moments and get the characterization of Frank Arthur the way Gertrude Stein pictures him. Arthur had been born right in the middle of a big country. Where was he born? Ms. Dunlap, any ideas? Press your button and we... Right.
In the middle of the United States.
Right. But, as I told you at the beginning, you can start with the minimalist perspective, and then you must begin to fill in the blanks that Gertrude Stein is providing. So let's go one step further. The middle of the country could be what state? Oklahoma. What city in Oklahoma? Oklahoma City. Ada, Oklahoma. Norman, Oklahoma. I was stationed in Lawton, Oklahoma. The point is that when Gertrude Stein says he'd been born right in the middle of a big country, you're supposed to fill it in. You're supposed to move from the minimalist state into the fuller state. Arthur, he knew when he was a tiny boy that the earth was round, so it was never a surprise to him. He knew that trees had green leaves, and that there was snow when time for snow came, and rain when time for rain came. He knew a lot. Now that seems to be a very simple statement. Tell me what it means. What is Gertrude Stein telling us this boy knows? I'll read it again. In fact, let's put it on the screen so we can look at it and zoom in right there. Focus. He knew when he was a tiny boy that the earth was round, so it was never a surprise to him. He knew that trees had green leaves and that there was snow when time for snow came, and rain when time for rain came. He knew a lot. What is Gertrude Stein telling us about this man's perception? Someone before had said, Gertrude Stein seems Lockean. I'm looking at you, Ms. Harris.
He's well educated, because the earth was round, and that was a few hundred years before his birth. He seems to know about his surroundings. He pays attention. He's an observer, and he knows a lot. I mean, I guess compared to herself, she thinks that he's extremely well educated and knows a lot about a lot of things.
Right, Ms. Dunlap.
He accepts change. He accepts nature. He accepts the effects of it.
Yes, I think that we have the realization that this man is perceptive, he's conscious, he's knowledgeable. And so Ida marries Frank Arthur. When Arthur was little, he knew a handsome boy who had a clubfoot and was tall and thin and worked for a farmer. The boy with the clubfoot rode a bicycle, and he would stand and lean on his bicycle and tell Arthur everything. He told him all about dogs. Now, how can you learn talking about dogs? That is, one of the things that Ida learns from Arthur is life. How people learn empirically. He told him how a little dog, good, back on the screen, thank you. He told him how a little dog, once he had found out about it, would just go on making love to anything. The hind leg of a big dog, a leg of a table, anything. He told him how a young hunting dog's voice changed. It cracked just like a boy's voice, just like boys' voices did. And then it went up and down, and then finally it settled down. He told him about shepherd's dogs and how shepherds only could work their dogs 8 years. That when the dog was 9 years old, the shepherd had to hang him. That often the shepherd was awfully sad and cried like anything when he had to hang his dog to kill him. But he could not keep him after the dog was 8 years old. They did not really care anything for sheep after that. And how could you feed a dog if he did not care about sheep anymore? And so the shepherd sometimes cried a lot. Then he told Arthur about another dog and a girl. She always used to give that dog a lump of sugar whenever she saw him. She was a girl in a store where they sold sugar. And then one day she saw the man come in who had the dog. And when he came, she said, "Where is the dog?" And he said, "The dog is dead." She had a piece of sugar in her hand. And when he said that, she put the piece of sugar in her mouth and ate it, and then burst out crying. What is Gertrude Stein telling us here? Any comments, Ms. Hoyt?
I don't know, but maybe, she ate the sugar just sort of to deny that she was looking for the dog in the first place, because all of a sudden she didn't want to hear the dog was dead, so she just did away with the sugar.
Denial and accommodation. And what we have here, of course, is a whole episode of love, sexuality, sensuality, devotion, passion, separation, malaise, moroseness, disappointment, accommodation, and a realization that you must go on. I think that Ida is a powerful story because the minimalist detail is replete with maximal data. There's just nothing that isn't here, if you want to put it there. And it's not as though we're looking at the text and we're dreaming up what Gertrude Stein hasn't given us. I think everything you're saying, everything I'm saying, she has given us. It's here. You have to decode it. And you have to understand the way she's dealing with it. How many boys and how many women have learned about sex not from parents and not from teachers, but from conversations outdoors, conversations around pets, and conversations by themselves. What happens to Arthur, this first of her husbands? And Ida has many husbands. On page 37. Arthur was not very good at climbing. All he could do was listen to the little man. He told about how he climbed to the top of a gate, to the top of a door, to the top of a pole, this man Arthur listened to. The little man's name was Bernard. He said it was the same name as that of a saint. Then, well, naturally, then he went away. He finally did go away alone. Arthur was almost old enough to go away. pretty soon he did go away. He tried several ways of going away, and finally he went away on a boat and got shipwrecked and had his ear frozen. We find out on page 38 the saga of Arthur continuing. He did lots of things before he went back to the middle of the big country where he had been born. Finally, he became an officer in the army, and he married Ida. But before that, he lived around. Where did he live? What were his experiences? One of the things he did was to sleep in a bed under a bridge. The bed was made of cardboard. He was not the first to make it. Somebody else made it, but when Arthur had no place to go, because he had used up all his money, he used to go to sleep there. Someone always was asleep there. Day and night, there was always someone sleeping there. Arthur was one who, when he woke up, shaved and washed himself in the river. He always carried the things with him. We discover on page 39 that Arthur does go in the army. He serves in the army. He feels everyone should be in the army. Everybody wants a king. And so he becomes a soldier. But we find everybody wants a king, but not everybody wants a queen. And so the question is that while Ida wanted Arthur, Arthur at one point didn't want her. And so we see the end of Arthur's story. Ida never saw Arthur again. She just did not. She went somewhere and there she just sat. She did not even have a dog. She did not have a town. She lived alone and just sat. At the bottom of the page we read, somebody came and asked her where Arthur was. She said Arthur was gone. And pretty soon she was gone. And when she was gone, nobody knew what to say. Life just moves on, and there is always this progression. Ida went to live with a cousin of her uncle. Now we get another type of episode. This is more narrative. This is more episodic. But let's see how minimalist it is, and let's see how formidable it is. Now, after this episode, there are a number of husbands that Ida has. One of her major husbands, and the one whom she lives with at the end of the novel, and the one whom she stays with at the end of the novel, is Andrew Hamilton. We'll talk about that. But I want to, first of all, talk about this episode. And then I want to go to her discussion of dogs. Because her discussion of dogs looks so obscure and so indifferent to pragmatics and so uniquely indifferent to her human relationships that we wonder why they're there. But we're going to take a little bit of time looking at Ida and the dogs. And you may think this is an odd way to focus. Here I began by spending some time on religion. Then I focused on how she deals with Arthur, how she moves from the enfance into the state of marriage. I'm going to go back a little bit, but when you read Gertrude Stein, you don't have to read in a linear fashion. All you have to do is try to find out what she's doing. I've mentioned before that I think there are great books in literature. But when you read them, you don't have to read them for plot. You read them for the message. You read them for the sententious episodes. You read Moby Dick for the lifeline and the Heidelberg Tun and the squeeze. Those chapters that give us a sense of life, mortality, those metaphysical chapters that give us a sense of the extension of time beyond life. And I think we get some of that here. But let's look at this episode, because it's closer to narrative than others. If you don't go to page 41, Ida goes to live with a cousin of her uncle after her departure from Arthur. He was an old man, and he could gild picture frames so that they looked as if they had always had gold on them. He was a good man, that old man. He had a son. He sometimes thought that he had two sons, but anyway, he had one, and that one had a garage, and he made a lot of money. Why would he sometimes think if he had two sons, if he had one son? The son's best friend is one of the comments we get. Let's go on. We may answer that question later on. He had a partner, and they stole from one another. Now, why do you think he thinks he has two sons?
Sometimes he's good and sometimes he's bad.
Terrific, yes. You're on cue. You've got the codes. It's beginning to move in. Yes. Sometimes I don't know who you are, a mother will say to a youngster. Yes. Do I hear someone from outside? Is Mr. Keats there? Do I hear the ghost of someone from our outlying campuses? All right. He had a partner, and they stole from one another. Notice nothing simplistic about this plot. It's not as though you've a white hat and a black hat. These are partners stealing from each other. One day, the son of the old man was so angry because the partner was most successful in getting the most that he up and shot him. They arrested him. They put him in jail. They condemned him to 20 years hard labor because the partner whom he had killed had a wife and 3 children. The man who killed the other one had no children. That is to say, his wife had one, but it was not his. Anyway, there it was. His mother spent all her time in church praying that her son's soul should be saved. The wife of their doctor said it was all their father and mother's fault. They had brought up their son always to think of money, always of money. Had not they, the old man and his wife, got the cousin of the doctor's wife always to give them presents? Of course they had. Ida did not stay there very long. She went to live with the cousin of the doctor's wife, and there she walked every day and had her dog. The name of the dog was Claudine. Ida did not keep her. She gave her away. Ida's family is not the perfect family, the idealistic family, the glorified family, the family reminiscent of the past, who always get together for Christmas feasts and Easter feasts and celebrate the holidays and who share each other's happiness. Much of the family life here is dysfunctional. And Ida keeps going on. Ms. Harris.
I was going to say, it seems like, though, that even though her life seems dysfunctional, it seems like she's pointing to society, though, and society seems to be hanging on to the traditional family, because the son who had the family, it's the reason that the other son, the guy who shot the partner, he goes to jail because that partner had a family. And he doesn't have a real family because his wife has a child by somebody else. It's not really his son, so it doesn't matter. And it seems like that she's pointing to, society only recognizes the traditional families. It doesn't recognize the other family.
And in so many instances, when we meet Ida's various husbands, she always is resting. You notice the phrase throughout the book, Ida is resting, and Ida rests, And that is resting and resting and resting. What does resting mean? What does resting mean? Things are moving along at a normal pace. Things have achieved an equilibrium. And so whenever you see her resting and resting and resting, you're at equilibrium. And then something always moves on. All right, I'd like to turn, since we did mention the dogs here, I want to move to our discussion of dogs. And those of you who are in the television audience will get these sheets. But if you turn to, let's see what page we're on. Yeah. Okay. Turn to page 13, right? This is the second half of the category under social behavior. So let me find it on my sheets here, and then we'll move on. Let's I'm going to run down this list, and you understand that in Chapter 9, on page 97, on page 98, on page 99, and then in the second half, in pages 103, 105, and we move on. There are a number of dogs. You have the puppy in the garden, Prince. You have a little black who is a little black tan dog. You have a brown dog, a water dog. You have Sandy the Pekingese, Lilyman the French bulldog, Dick the French poodle, Mary Rose the fox terrier, the chocolate dog run over by an auto, Mary Rose's daughter Blanchette, Polyby, the tall killer dog, Never Sleep, Basket, and these are the later dogs. But let's look at some of these dogs. Turn to page 96. Page 96. The first dog I ever remember seeing, I had seen cats before, and I must have seen dogs, but the first dog I ever remember seeing was a large puppy in the garden. Nobody knew where he came from, so we called him Prince. It was a very nice garden, but he was a dog, and he grew very big. I do not remember what he ate, but he must have eaten a lot because he grew so big. I do not remember playing with him very much. He was very nice, but that was all. Like tables and chairs are nice. That was all. Then there were a lot of dogs, but none of them interesting. Then there was a little dog, a black and tan, and he hung himself on a string when somebody left him. He had not been so interesting, but the way he died made him very interesting. I do not know what he had as a name. What we are getting is a story about dogs, but what we are getting is the experience of people. There are people like dogs who run about. There are people who like to eat. There are people who are nondescript. And there are people who will hang themselves and whose lives, having meant little to people, mean almost nothing themselves. So you can almost take these dogs and understand the objectification. Gertrude Stein standing back and giving us through the dogs the mirror of people who are alive. Page 98. A dog has to have a name and he has to look at you. Sometimes it is a kind of bothering to have them look at you. You know, if you don't train your dog right, he will look at you. If you go to the kitchen and open the refrigerator and take out some meat, and the dog's there begging by you, and you give the dog the meat, you've made a fatal mistake. The dog will forever look at you and want you to give it meat. If you never give that dog that piece of meat, the dog won't know it's supposed to get the meat. Give it to him once, and that dog will look at you. And through his eyes, he will haunt you. And at your table, you will be unable to refuse him food because he will watch you. A dog has to have a name, and he has to look at you. And sometimes it is kind of bothering to have them look at you. However you train your dog, he looks at you the way you train him. If he knows you're supposed to go for a walk at a certain time, if he knows that after you finish doing the dishes, you're going to take him for a walk, he will sit there waiting. And if you don't take him for a walk, you will feel guilty. The dog may never know that you don't take him for a walk, because we don't know what dogs really think. But you will feel guilty for not having performed this ablution that you must perform for your dog every night, having trained yourself or having him train you to take him for a walk. So dogs will bother you. Any dog is new, says Gertrude Stein. The dogs I knew then, which were not mine, were mostly very fine. There was a Pekingese named Sandy. He was a very large one. Pekingeses should be tiny, but he was a big one, like a small lion. But he was all Pekingese. I suppose anywhere there can be giants, and he was a giant Pekingese. Now, what is the personality of this giant Pekingese? Are we looking at dogs or are we looking at human beings? We're looking at Gertrude Stein's capability to transform her minimalist sentence art, her minimalist prose narrative into a full picture that you imprint upon your own mind. And like that Picasso, you may see what looks like a very simple image. But a child could not write that image because it comes from a full-size bull, as I showed you in that original drawing. These simple sentences are part of Gertrude Stein's sensibility, but they emerge from such a mass of material that honing them into this simplicity is a major intellectual act, and we're expected to understand it. Sandy was his name because he was that color, the color of sand. There's your repetition. He should have been carried around. Pekingese mostly are, but he was almost too heavy to carry. I liked Sandy. When he stood up on the table all ruffled up and his tail all ruffled up He did look like a lion, a very little lion, but a fierce one. He did not like climbing the mountains. Does he climb mountains? How can you climb mountains in a household? He can climb mountains, but to a dog, anything may look as like a mountain looks to a human being. They were not real mountains. They were made of a man on 2 chairs, and Sandy was supposed to climb him as if he were climbing a mountain. Sandy thought this was disgusting, and he was right. Now here's a man who says, "Come on up here, dog. Come on up here, boy." The dog jumps up, you see. Gertrude Stein says, "This is stupid. What's the dog doing this for?" So she's the one who finds it disgusting, not the dog, because the dog doesn't have thought. You know, in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, he talks about the 2 dogs chasing a hare. And he says they look as though they are working in concert, that they're thinking together, that they're chasing these dogs, they're chasing their prey. He says, but it's not so. Men can plan how to chase their prey, but animals operate instinctively. So we're not talking about human personalities. And when the dog finds jumping up on his master's lap, or jumping up, disgusting, it's Gertrude Stein, it's Ida, who sees this as being a foolish set of acts. No use calling a thing like that climbing the mountains. And if it has been really mountains, of course Sandy would not have been there. Sandy liked things flat, tables, floors, and paths. How about those word salads? Remember I mentioned to you at the beginning of this session how Gertrude Stein gives us word salads, how she jumbles them together and you mix them together. Here they are. Everything flat, tables, floors, and paths. He liked waddling along as he pleased. No mountains, no climbing, no automobiles. He was killed by one. The plot. No intervention. The dog is dead. Sandy knew what he liked, flat things and sugar. Sugar was flat too, and Sandy never was interested in anything else. And then one day, an automobile went over him. Poor Sandy, and that was the end of Sandy. And Sandy, yes?
Sandy, the dog that the girl was bringing the sugar to, do you think?
It could have been. These are associations. In this case, Sandy was... I'd have to check again on that association, but it's possible. But there's a bit of humor here too, right? Sandy likes things that are flat, and suddenly Sandy is flat. Flattened. There's a certain morbidity to Gertrude Stein's humor, but there's a great deal of humor in this book. We'll eventually get some of it, but we haven't focused on that. So 1 changed to 2, and 2 changed to 5, and the next dog was also not a big one. His name was Lilliman, and he was black and a French bull and not welcome. He was that kind of a dog. He just was not welcome. 1 changed to 2, and 2 changed to 5, and the next dog was not a big one. How can 1 change to 2 and 2 change to 5?
They reproduced. That, had 2 had 3.
1 dog became 2, and 2 gave 5 puppies. Right. This is coding. Now, that may not be at all what Gertrude Stein was saying, but I can't think of a better interpretation.
Well, it could be the passage of time. I mean, like, maybe 5 months passed or 5 years passed, and then she came to the other one. 1 became 2, etc., like that.
Yes, that would be a good interpretation, too. The passage of time. And every time we see Ida resting between episodes, resting and resting and resting, it's also a time element, the passage of time. Let's see about this dog. When he came, he was not welcome, and he came very often. He was good looking. He was not old. He did finally die and was buried under a white lilac tree in a garden, but he just was not welcome. There are some people in this world whom you don't want to spend time with.
Dr. Rothman?
Yes.
I'd like to interject here that, maybe I've been reading a lot about it, and I'm thinking that maybe that dog could have been Matisse at that point, because at the later part of their relationship, Matisse kind of was very, he kind of intruded on their hospitality and didn't make himself welcome at all. And I think the fact that he was French and unwelcome might have been, a little play on Matisse.
I think that not only is this a possibility, if you want to get autobiographical, and certainly some of these episodes are autobiographical, this would be a good note in American Notes and Queries if it hasn't been done before. And just jot it down and draw your analogy and send in your note to American Notes and Queries, and you will have a statement that other people might examine and respond to. I think that one can spend a great deal of time, and conceivably should, trying to see where Gertrude Stein is making these associations. Now, mind you, there's this novel written in 1940. She's 60 years old, and looking back, objectifying, distancing herself from experiences, and yet giving us a narrative of human love, human sexuality, sensuality, giving us a novel of associations that are lasting and associations that are ephemeral, and giving us what we could call a relatively contemporary novel, although in her parlance, in her style, in her diction, we have to learn to uncode it. And I think tonight what we've partially done is uncode or decode some of Gertrude Stein's language. Yes.
Would you say that this is kind of an extension of Kafka and the social isolation and the social displacement, and we see a result of there's a loss of absolute values, and she's moving into I don't know what, a breakdown of all of the traditional roles and everything that we saw before Kafka.
What I've tried to do in introducing this novel, along with Kafka and Leaving Cheyenne and Weidmann's The Hiding Place, which will be our last book, what I've tried to do is to try to understand the voice of the 20th century. And I think, indeed, there's a great deal of alienation and differentiation. One of the differences between others and Gertrude Stein is that if, in fact, and we have some indication that there's an autobiographical context here, Gertrude Stein invited people to her house. She wanted people to come. She almost led a literary salon in France at Rue Fleury. The famous 27 Rue Fleury is her famous French address. People are always coming, and you get this in this book too. There are always people coming. And she's always waiting and waiting, and she's receiving. And when she's in Washington, D.C., and serving as a hostess, people are always coming. She's always doing things for people. When she went to America and exhibited Batiste in San Francisco, and then when she went on lecture tours around the country, and was celebrated as one of the most famous American writers. Indeed, she always had people coming to her. Now, the difference was that she was essentially very, very different in her lifestyle. She was the man in the relationship with Alan Toklas. She wore men's clothing. And yet, and with this sense of independence, she found herself greatly alienated from the normal, conventional life of married couples. One of the reasons we get so much of the conventional life of married couples, and either ending almost in a absolute husband-wife situation, an absolute familial situation, is perhaps Alice Toklas's reconciliation with conventional love and her own relationship, which she looked upon as being a conventional love situation. She didn't, and I think perhaps the synthesis of her own circumstances with what society viewed as normal circumstances becomes not a symbiosis, but a total synthesis, a total merging of her life and the life of conventional people, so that she saw herself finally as being a conventional lover. And that's why this novel seems capable of, that's why this novel has so many relationships where she sustains herself. Now, others may say that because she has so many different husbands in this novel, at least 6, that it in fact resists a normal husband-wife relationship. It doesn't last. It's chimerical. She marries, she's with the man, and she goes on. However, the conclusion of the novel, in her life with Andrew, and she says, regardless the others, he is the first, and he is the only, and he is the one. She sustains and ends with an enduring situation. And of course, she and Alice B. Toklas had an enduring situation. In her mind, there was no difference between her relationship and the normal situation. All right, let's move into another area. We've emphasized the husbands. We've emphasized the point of religion. We've mentioned certain social situations. I'd like to now turn to economics as a major thesis in concluding or moving toward the end of our discussion. And I think that I'd like to focus on economics because, again, these deal with the pragmatics of life. And a great deal of this novel does deal with the pragmatics of life. When you deal with economics in this novel, there are certain equations that one faces. One is food, money, property, and how the relationships between people are defined by these terms. In the early part of the novel, the family is most stable when it has plenty to eat. The family lives in houses and hotels. And then look at page 14, where she talks about the refugees of the world. And then she began to look far away, and she began to think about her parents. She remembered them when she grew a little older, but there were plenty to take care of her, and they did. Think of all the refugees there are in the world. Just think. Page 15, Ida meets a woman, a rag woman. Bottom of page 15. She was out, it was towards evening, it was time when public parks were closed, and Ida was looking in through the railing, and she saw right across the corner that someone else was looking and looking at her. It was a policeman. He was bending down and looking at her. She was not worrying, but she did wonder why he was getting down to look at her across the corner. And then she saw, next to her, a very old woman. Well, was it or was it not a woman? She had so much clothing on and so many things hanging from her. And she was carrying so many things, she might have been anything. Ida went away. It was time for her to be at home. The policeman looking at this beggar woman. Page 16, she sees someone carrying a sign on his back, advertising an eating place. Ida paid no attention to that. She did one day see a man carrying an advertisement on his back, a sandwich man. That was all right. But what was funny was that he stopped and he was talking as if he knew him and he was talking as if he knew him to a big, well-dressed, rich man. So now you have the difference between the man carrying the sign, persuading someone who looked rather affluent to come into the restaurant and eat. So you get these economic class differences. Gertrude Stein's family apparently had sufficient wealth that she never had to worry about money. So it becomes somewhat of a moment when people of this wealth, independence, show some compassion or some concern. I don't know if she shows compassion. Yes, she does. She shows compassion for the bag woman, for the woman wearing the clothing. She shows compassion for the sandwich man because she isolates them. She makes them their moment, our moment. And once she does that, she makes her compassion part of our understanding. Page 21, we see a woman carrying a bundle of wash. Page 22, men coming off a farm. Page 25, Ida purchasing shoes. This becomes part of her business to buy shoes from people. There's an economic value here. And page 31, moths eating at army uniforms. So you have to replace these uniforms. I want to turn to a passage here, though, that's of some interest. Let's go to page 123. This is part 2, chapter 5, on page 123. And let's see what happens here. This is an episode we had mentioned earlier. And this is moving on into the evangelical passage, the passage I had mentioned to you. They're talking about good and bad luck. Look on page 122. Bad luck are spiders, cuckoos, goldfish, and dwarfs. Except the spider at night makes delight, so it's a good sign. The spider in the morning makes morning, it's a bad sign. You have good signs and you have bad signs. The sky red at night is a sailor's delight. The sky red in the morning is a sailor's warning. The same sign can have bad images and good images. Just like the man with his son. The son, he has two sons, one who's good at times, one who is bad at times. But we're talking about economics. And if you look at the page, bottom of page 123, we have the sound of the cuckoo. Now the cuckoo is a bad sign. I am a cuckoo. I am not a clock, because a clock makes time pass. And I stop the time by giving mine. And mine is money, and money is honey. And if I bring money, I bring misery and money, but never honey. Listen to me. Again, what is the symbolism of this passage? What is Gertrude Stein telling us about economics? What is she telling us about wealth? What is she telling us about the sign of the cuckoo? I am not a clock, because a clock makes time pass, and I stop the time by giving mine. And mine is money, and money is honey. And if I bring money, I bring misery and money, but never honey. Listen to me. Yes?
Money corrupts.
Money corrupts, and the cuckoo is a sign of corruption because it stops time. This novel is timeless. Whenever Ida is resting and resting and resting, we know that events are moving in a commonplace fashion, that they're routine, that they're mundane, but always there will be this transformation into time. Time is always metamorphosed. By the way, Miss Harris, that's an interesting analogy to Kafka. Time metamorphoses. We always know with Ida that when she's resting and resting and resting, that there will be change. She's going to go from one man to the next. She's going to go from the man sleeping under to her soldier Andrew. She's going to go from one dog to another. She's going to go from her aunt, from her aunt to her grandfather. We always know that this novel is in a state of metamorphosis. We're not concerned about time. She'll move from one city to another, from one state to another, from one country to another. And time moves on. We know when she's 16. We know when she's 60. We're not sure what's happening in between. When she's 16, we see her in the novel leaving home. When she's 60, she's writing the novel and publishing it. Metamorphosis. There's always a change, and Ida is always moving on. Now, there's a certain stability in her instability, and the stability lies in her accommodation to this metamorphosis and to this change. So that the novel Ida, I think, begins to make sense to us. At first, when you pick it up and you read it in its minimalist state, you will understand that the words are selected to reduce and eliminate as much as possible from the mind that's stating it and from the reader. But because the words have come from a wealth of information, from a world of experience, and from a world of acceptance and denial, a world of alienation and restitution. Because this world is so full, so replete with information, so detailed in experience, the minimalist language reduces it to essence. The essence of the bull I showed you in that first image when we started this lecture. And then you ask to go back and remember what she's talking about. to draw from your own experience, from her background, to fill it in. And so what we have is the great artist entering minimalist art, the great author giving us minimalist prose. But nothing minimalist is devoid of information. And that, in essence, is what gives inspiration in life to Ida. What you're reading is a 153-page novel that stretches into 600 pages or a million words. Obviously, the sheets you have indicate that you could be spending another 12 hours with Ida. But we'll conclude at this point and allow you the time to review your sheets and to reread Ida, now aware of how much you missed going through it the first time. Thank you.